Hello, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to wait just another couple of minutes to have our audience here log in, and then we'll get going. All right. Well, good morning from wherever, or afternoon, wherever you're calling in from. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Pandas and Prose. My name is Jenna Bonello, and I will be your host for today. This event is to honor and celebrate Pollinator Week, which actually was last week. And so it's a culmination of that in support of pollinator health to raise awareness for pollinators like bees and butterflies and other species, and spread the word about what we can do to protect them. And also, before we begin, I know that there are a lot of passionate WWF donors and supporters on this call. And so I just wanted to offer a very special shout out to our recurring donors and our WWF heroes. Thank you so much. Thank you for your support. And we're so excited to have you here with us today. So now for a few logistics. This is a Zoom webinar, which means all of the participant cameras and mics are turned off, but you're able to ask questions in the chat. So please ask your questions throughout. We have monitors, and we're hoping to get to as many audience questions as possible throughout this event. And it is being recorded for those who had family or friends who wanted to join. We'll be able to watch on YouTube after. And so without further ado, today I am joined by Clay Bolt, the manager of pollinator conservation for WWF. In this role, Clay leads WWF's strategy to protect pollinators through habitat restoration, pesticide reduction, and pro-pollinator policies. He is based in Livingston, Montana, near the banks of the Yellowstone River. So Clay, welcome. And again, we're beyond thrilled to have Camille Dungy here with us to talk about her newest book, Soil, the story of a Black mother's garden. She has also written 4 collections of poetry, including the essay collection Guidebook to Relative Strangers. And she's edited Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry, and co-edited the From the Fishouse Poetry Anthology. Camille is the poetry editor for Orion magazine, and her honors include the Academy of American Poets Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an American Book Award, an Honorary Doctorate from SUNY ESF, and fellowships from the NEA in both prose and poetry. So thank you again so much to both of you for being here for this conversation. And so Clay, over to you to get things started.
Thanks, Jenna, and thanks again so much, Camille, for joining us. We're so honored to have you here today for Pandas and Prose. Before we dive into the content, I just wanted to first kick things off by asking, where are you currently in the world and how have you been keeping busy and spending your time lately?
I am in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is in northern Colorado, about 30 minutes from the southern border of Wyoming and about an hour north of Denver. I'm keeping busy a little bit trying to keep the garden from burning itself up in the heat, and also hanging out with my daughter in her the little glints that I get her in summer.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's very relatable. It's not so far from me here in Livingston, Montana, and the weather has been very interesting this year. Lots of rain in the spring, which is not typical for us, and then yeah, some extremes of temperature. So I totally feel what you're saying about keeping the garden going. As a longtime gardener myself, I both love and sometimes loathe the labor that's required each year to keep the garden going. And I was curious for you, what is it about gardening that compels you to remain dedicated to that task season after season?
There's so much. It's one of the simple answers is just the beauty that the garden returns, the surprises and delights, the kinds of neighbors who come by, watching other humans walk by and point and ask questions and appreciate, but then the birds and the bunnies and the butterflies and just starting to see so many different species of creatures thriving and surviving just makes it worthwhile. It's a positive feedback loop for sure.
Yeah, it's amazing to me as well, like the kinds of things that show up and the species that just suddenly seem to appear out of nowhere. And I think that
Yeah,
for
it
me,
seems like that, right? Like they really weren't there when, you know, when we moved into this house, it was a very monochromatic kind of yard with just turf and river rock and a few cedar bushes and junipers, and so there really was not a whole lot that flitted about. And now I've got an app on my phone, an insect identifier, because I'm like, what are you? You know, there's just so many. I had no idea there were so many kinds of flies and bees, you know, and so um that's fun.
oh yeah, it's so fun. I remember once I planted a mock orange in my garden, and about a year later, I saw this strange little black bee, and I was like, what is this bee? And it turned out that it was a mock orange specialist bee. And as far as I know, there were no mock oranges anywhere nearby. So how did it find its way to my garden? It just felt like such a gift.
That's so cool. Do you think
Uh,
maybe like the little eggs were on the plant when you planted it, or they really just kind of found it?
I think it found it because I think this bee, being a type of mason bee, probably nested in either in cavities in wood or similar kinds of cavities. So maybe it's just that it wasn't, it's a specialist, but it visits other kind of plants. So maybe it just kind of, leapfrogged its way to my yard. But that's one of the great mysteries. I love how when we provide these spaces for insects and other species, how they show up. They really,
Hmm.
you build it and they will come.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned is how people stop by and visit and talk with you when you're doing your gardening work. And I think in my experience, gardens have the capacity to break down barriers and can be conversation starters too. So I was wanting to ask you, what has gardening revealed to you about your community, and has your garden sparked any memorable conversations with friends and neighbors?
That is such a great question. I mean, I talk a lot about how the garden to me becomes both an uh, metaphorical and an actual space of showing the benefits of diversification and creating vibrant intersectional integrated communities, right? And the garden works that way because I went from this turf and rock to, I don't know, probably 150 different species of plants, honestly, in this very small space. And so that is a kind of diversification. And then all the pollinators and other non-human creatures who come to it. But I didn't have that many conversations with my neighbors either. And I live in a primarily predominantly white community, and where was essentially the only Black family here. And so before the garden, there was that division too. And now the kinds of conversations that I have with people, it's not just about the plants. Then we end up talking about, they know, a number of people know I'm a writer. So then they talk about the books that they're reading and give me book recommendations, and I give them book recommendations. And we do sometimes talk about politics, but usually local politics, not the national politics, but like who's running for the school board and who's running for city council. And by the way, I'm running for the health division, they'll say, and I can end up having conversations with people about the decisions that are being made on a community level and a local level that will impact all of our daily lives. And what's happening at the schools, and why did you choose that school for your child instead of this one? And like real important conversations that I don't know what other space I would be having those with people who aren't direct colleagues or aren't directly, the parents of children who my daughter is in class with. And so I just really love that. It's a opportunity to have community, and a broadened community that I hadn't seen before I started playing in the front yard.
That's super relatable. And to be honest, when I'm at home and I'm not working, I tend to want to hide away maybe in the backyard, but the garden that I'm working on the most right now is my little front yard garden. and I have to go out and water it. I have to do some weeding. And so it kind of forces me to interact with the community in a way that I don't think I would otherwise. And you're absolutely right. People from all walks of life come through, not just the people within my social bubble. And, sometimes I'll be in my office working and I'll have the window open and I can hear the neighbor bringing her grandchildren down to look at the flowers in the garden. And to me, that there's something really special about that.
Absolutely. Yes.
So, I'm sure that some of the people that are listening to us or people that have read your book, Soil, are thinking, okay, I want to create a garden of my own. I'm really excited about this. But of course, one of the challenges that I think a lot of people face is dealing with HOAs or dealing with this social stereotype against digging up the lawn, which is starting to change. But I was curious, why do you think so many of us hold up lawns as the gold standard of yard care? And why do you suspect that those of us who step out of line, like you and I, allowing our former lawns to return to a more normal, natural state, risk ridicule from the community at times?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the answer it goes back to two violences in American history and world history, and they go back to World War I and II, and after World War I and II, this sort of a lot of chemical weapons that were just sitting around. We had the ability to make it, and there were stockpiles. And like, so what do you do with Agent Orange now? You turn it into an herbicide or a pesticide, right? So I mean, like truly a lot of the herbicides and pesticides that we use in our lawn are warfare, chemicals from warfare that we've then converted to wage war on the other than human species who are living around us. And so that's a violence that I would prefer to not participate in myself. And then the other is racial segregation and ideas about codes of what lives can live next door to other lives. And so a kind of model of a perfect kind of yard had a monochromatic and really systemic look. And anybody who violated those norms was suspect. And so again, I don't want to participate in that kind of homogenized thinking because I understand its connections to often in this case sort of de facto like implied expectations of cultural propriety that often really actively excluded non-white people in this country who often would have different kinds of landscaping aesthetics and so refusing those people also meant refusing some of those landscaping aesthetics, like don't have front yard gardens and things like that. We've had like little moments where the Victory Garden or things like that were kind of momentarily acceptable and then things would sort of lock back in. I think though that more and more around the country I'm seeing a shift in a desire for a diversified landscape in people's yards where they have control over that. When you are sad and realize you don't see as many butterflies around for your kids or grandchildren as you did when you were a child, and then are able to follow that and be like, but there's also not as many of the pollinating plants for the pollinators to flock to. Maybe I can replace some of this lawn and put in some a pollinator garden. Sorry. I feel like more and more people are being able to make that connection and also finding the beauty of these flowering plants in particular to be able to welcome the pollinators to them. So I'm seeing I'm seeing more and more individuals and also organizations like Wild Ones, who's one of those national organizations that gets people together to support native and pollinator friendly plants and things like that, that I see just around the country, and people having more interest in often starting small
Mhm.
and going bigger and bigger in creating a kind of change. So I'm hopeful that the derision that those of us who have pushed against the common law get will shift to that being more of the norm than the oddity.
I certainly hope so, and I appreciate that thoughtful answer. And it's so important, I think, for us to investigate the roots of why, because over time it's just becomes the norm. But those points are very well taken, and I think one of the things I love about No Mow May, which is a trend that has sort of swept the nation, but also received some pushback because dandelions, while important for certain bees, are not as good as native wildflowers. And I think we know that. But I think what's so great about a process like No Mow May is that you don't really have to do anything. It's just allowing the grass to grow a little bit. And I think the most important part of that is that it makes it okay. It gives people permission to, be a little bit lazy for a little while. And that allows, I don't know, it's creating a social change, I think, which is really important. And I think that you're right. I do think that the norms are starting to change. And I think that's really encouraging. I mean, when I think about when I started gardening 20 something years ago, things were very different. So we are seeing the needle shift just a bit. When I think back to when I first started gardening 20 years ago, my oldest son is 20. I have a 2-year-old and a 17-year-old, and I remember sometimes feeling pretty selfish as a parent. I'm out doing my thing as a photographer. I was looking for things to photograph, and I remember when my kids were little, having this moment where I was really focused, and they were like, "Daddy, Daddy, look at this thing," and I was like frustrated by it. But I did have this moment where I realized if I don't take myself away from the things that I'm super focused on right now, that I think are super important, and take the time to teach them and share my joy with them, then what term experience with nature. And so I love how in your book you write a lot about your experiences with your daughter. And I was curious, from your perspective as a parent, how do we make space for self-reflection in nature for ourselves while also honoring a child's need for guidance in the natural world?
Right. And I think in soil, I don't have one simple answer to that question, because it's not a simple answer. I think that frustration is very human and very real. And at the same time, I think, one of the great gifts that the garden teaches me is that more than one thing can be true at once. So frequently the garden models that in this corner this plant is thriving, and that corner this plant is not thriving. It's the same plant, and it seems like it's the same soil. So how can two things be simultaneously so different and so true? And I think that that's the case for parenting in any way. It's like, depending on what the light is at that particular moment, something that feels so wonderful and refreshing and interconnected and entertaining can also be like draining and difficult. I found that understanding the garden as a space of welcome that my daughter could be part of, if she chose to, um, not being really precious about it, not having that sort of, you can't touch this or don't touch that, helps me if she decides she really likes a flower and wants to pick it, or does a cartwheel and accidentally falls into something, and sort of, right, like I could see that if I didn't really um propagate that sense of this is a space of welcome, that could make me quite upset. But I also use it as a space of education where I like to talk to her about what the different plants are and why they're useful and how they're useful, and that actually we are weeding these dandelions, but we're not just going to throw them in the compost. Here are all these other useful things for us, like because I don't use herbicides and pesticides in this garden, these plants are incredibly nutritious, and we could be eating them in 17 different kinds of preparations. And so talking about those kinds of things and being able to see this growing space as not just a space for my own aesthetic beauty, but something that serves the birds and the pollinating insects, something that can be also a source of nutrition and support for ourselves. Those kinds of, I think, more holistic experiences with the garden that are not purely reciprocal, I mean, like, not reciprocal, but like, what is that? Resources. Like the garden isn't just a resource for us to extract. There we go. The human need or human beauty, but also like this whole community, interconnected community. That then I think changes her attitude about not just the garden, but the world. And it helps me be less precious about my own time and what's happening there outside.
Yeah, that I almost get a little emotional thinking about, as you talk through that, because I have this memory of planting columbines, and I planted the flower the year before, the seeds, and then it took about 2 seasons for it to bloom. And my oldest son, Adam, at the time was just a little toddler, and he like picked the flower. I'd been waiting so long for it to grow, and he immediately picked it and brought it to me. And, at the time I was like, oh, trying to keep it in. But now I'm just thinking, what a sweet thing he did for me, And if I had been so precious, I didn't say anything to him. I just accepted it. But inside I was screaming. And now I think that was such a sweet gesture, that he wanted to give that beauty and share that with me. And so like, it teaches us a lot about what matters in life, I think. And I love just, again, the idea that gardens are not so precious. It's this opportunity for reciprocity that I think is so important.
Yeah. If I may too, on that point, um, I think one of the things about being a pollinator forward garden is that you really do need to have a variety of native plants that native to your area, um, which are often wildflowers that are very short-lived, that they'll bloom for a day or 2 days, maybe 2 weeks, and so that it feels like, oh, to pick it, like I gotta wait a whole nother year for it. Except that we don't have so many of the kind of megafauna herbivores in our areas anymore, who would be like happily walking around munching the heads of all of these plants. And we don't have the bison or the antelope or pronghorn. Antelope is anyway. They're not floating around our suburban yards probably so much. You may have deer, and I'm sorry if you're overrun by deer, but you don't, right? And so these plants have actually evolved to having their heads kind of nipped off and nibbled and such. And if we're not doing that, we're not actually triggering the plant's growth mechanisms and behaviors in the ways that they've been evolved to do. And so that's one of the things, like if I see a dog running through the front yard, like happily, I'm like, well, that big dog is about as close to a bison as I'm gonna get in my, whatever they're doing to the ground. These plants have evolved to expect that, right? And respond to it. That helps me. Again, it's like thinking larger than just myself, helps me calm down, right? And not be so sad when surprise happens.
You know, it's so funny because I think there, even though like, well, I'll speak for myself, like gardening allows this self-evolution that I think is so important. And like, I, even though we're trying to say like, we need to let nature be wild, there's still an amount of control that I think a lot of us feel when we're creating a garden. Like, this is a wild version of that, but we need to keep it within a fence still, so to speak. When, or literally even in some cases, when you realize that, like, as you're saying in nature, like here in the grasslands have to be grazed in order to remain a grassland. The hooves of bison and other, even cattle, penetrate the soil in a way that allows water to seep in. Like these plants have been a lot longer than we have, and they have figured out how to survive and then even welcome those changes and that adversity that comes their way. So you know, I feel like there could be a whole, maybe there is a philosophy book just on the things that we can learn from plants because they do really require that disturbance to survive, I think. And some plants even require that disturbance and thrive on that. So very, very good points. I want to return back just a little bit to what some of the things you were talking about with lawns. And I was really touched by this part in the book when you talked about, well, gardens, you know, like societal norms have a long, varied, often difficult history in the US. And in Soil, you're right, one of the most powerful tools of oppression is that certain lives are of little consequence, that what you grow and raise and build and love are inconsequential. And we've certainly seen this concept applied to plants and animals deemed useful or otherwise, you know, thinking about pesticides, to people and to the very people working the land as well. And from your perspective, how are gardens a metaphor for the health of a society and how we value life?
One of the things about creating this kind of diverse garden is it looks different from what a lot of models of uh particularly a suburban kind of style yard should look like. And it takes some time to train the eye to understand this other model as something that's beautiful and desirable. And that can often be the case if your experience hasn't been one of uh, having a diverse human community either. I write in the book about the number of white people in America who report having a non-white friend, like a non-white person in their inner community. And it's something like 75% of white Americans claim no non-white person in their inner circle. None at all. 75% of white Americans. So then it would take some time, right? It takes some time, experience, like an active desire to seek out experiences, lives, bodies that are different than your own to grow and change and be able to communicate and feel comfortable. If like 75%, I feel that the growth that is been happening for people in terms of being able to accept that kind of diversity in their yard can be metaphorical and actually a practical way towards reaching towards that kind of interpersonal shifting and changing as well.
Kind of along those lines, as we think about how we value life in the garden, and as somebody who focuses on the small things that I think oftentimes people overlook, you know, over 99% of life on Earth is smaller than your little finger. And so we tend to associate with other large creatures like ourselves that's often where we place our value. So why do you believe it's important to support pollinator and insect life, no matter where it's found, whether or not we can see a direct value that they provide for us?
Well, again, the garden has taught me a great deal about patience. So much, as you said, you planted those columbines and it was really 3 years before you got that first bloom. And now probably they're thriving, robust plants, right? But it takes a long time sometimes for the benefit that we are expecting to manifest, which doesn't mean that those 3 years nothing was happening, right? It was just not something that you were able to easily see, understand, and interpret. And so I feel that with figuring out how to support what I call greater than human life and letting go, in a sense, of being able to always see what the benefit is immediately has helped me trust that this kind of starting small, starting locally change can really make a much larger positive impact.
That's a great way to end our chat. Before we turn it over to the audience questions, Camille, I just want to thank you so much. And now, Janelle, I'll turn it over to
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Clyde. This has been such a beautiful conversation, and I think really gets at, right? For me, the book was just as much about gardening as it was about racial history in this country, the Black experience, and then also about motherhood. To me, that part really resonated. I have a 2.5-year-old. And so again, a lot of those pieces were just speaking to me. And so, you at one point cited a Mary Oliver poem, The Summer Day, right? What should you do with your one precious life? Where, she kept so still. She kneeled down in the grass. She kept so still. Grasshopper ate sugar out of her hand. And so you asked, I'll tell you what I would have done. The dishes, the laundry, a pile of work for pay. And that just so spoke to me, being, modern day motherhood. And Tara actually, one of our audience members, had a question too about the motherhood themes in this book, and so why was it important for you to get down on the page your experience being a mother during the pandemic? Why was that important to you? And then I have a follow-up question after.
Yeah, I knew I had a kind of rotten set of luck, as many of us did in 2020. I had a really incredible fellowship. I had a Guggenheim Fellowship where I was able to buy a year of time to write a book, and thought I was gonna write a book about what grew up from the soil around me. It turned out that the year was 2020 that I was gonna embark on a project. And so all of a sudden the book became much more complex. It wasn't that typical isolated, I'm just in the garden by myself thing. Like, I was homeschooling my daughter at the same time. And I realized that I wasn't gonna be able to write this book if I didn't absorb into its thinking that balance that I was doing as a parent, but also that then made me really force me to truly understand the deep interconnections of human social political experiences and the ways that we treat the greater than human world. Like, that they are so directly correlated, and it didn't feel possible to me anymore to write an isolated, solitary, still kind of book in the moment in which we live, which is a moment where we really, really need to be thinking about how each of our decisions webs out and connects with every other living being on this planet, and with our history, and with our economic and political decisions and actions. And so the book then became not just about gardening, right? It really, it couldn't stay there. It had to sort of grow more complex and interconnected.
Yeah. No, that definitely makes sense, right? As you were also helping to grow and nurture your daughter. Well, I've definitely recommended it to my mom's group here in Alexandria. So thank you
Thank
for
you.
including that piece of it. And actually, I guess speaking of just modern day, I most of the books I read are on an e-reader, right? But I'm so thankful I actually have this physical copy with me. I just loved the readers quotes that you chose to include. And I know, you reference in the acknowledgement that this piece of writing has really resonated across demographics. And so if you could speak to that just a little bit, just the responses that you've been getting and why you feel like just the content has resonated so deeply with people across the US and beyond.
I have been very, very gratified that the book's readership has reflected that diverse landscape that I'm trying to help cultivate. And so it's not just mothers who are interested in the book, and it's definitely not just Black people who are reading it. And so I think once I have learned to pay a kind of what a poet named Jan Zawicki calls animal bright attention to the world, I'm so frequently able to see the commonalities that I have with lives that might on the surface appear to be very different than my own. And I think in Soil, I make a real effort to point towards that. And I'm gratified that readers of all kinds, all age brackets and demographics of
Yeah.
all kinds have been able to see those connections as well.
That's great. And I know when we were talking previously, just with Clay, we were talking about these, I'm sick of using this word, right? Unprecedented, uncertain times, right? And so I guess before we close things out, in this time of, let's call it, right, the great uncertainty, how can tending a garden and just working with the land give us faith for keeping forward momentum, keeping forward progress during these very uncertain times that we're living in?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, just the science says that touching plants, talking to plants, having your hands in soil without without a lot of chemicals in it, the chemicals disrupt this disrupt this connection, but shift your serotonin levels, increase joy, decrease cortisol levels. It's like stress hormone. Give, like, actually literally make you happier, calmer, and like more mentally stable, right? So, in these
Oh,
uncertain
yes.
times, having something that will naturally work like an antidepressant. I mean, okay, I'll take that. Right? That's helpful. And then it works like an antidepressant because I know that at least in this little chunk of space, I've made a space for necessary living beings that I see less of, that we're all worried about. We should be worried about seeing less of, but I'm doing something in this small space, which also gives me a kind of comfort, maybe, and a kind of confidence that all is not lost, at least. Not right here. And I have enjoyed watching. When I first started this project, my yard was the one in the neighborhood, and now it's the reverse. So I know that I am part of a positive change, and so that too brings me a kind of comfort and a sense of security in a very, very unsecure moment.
Well, that's great. You're the trendsetter of your neighborhood.
I like to think that I'm really like a major part of a necessary cultural shift.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important. And Clay, you were that for me a couple of years ago. I planted our first native pollinators in our backyard, so that's been really beautiful to see grow too.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. You know, I feel like it's more about people just needing permission to like, it's contagious once you start. You just need to know it's okay.
Yeah, and you know what? If you haven't seen them and you don't know what they look like, what's that gonna, well, I don't know. I know what this plant that has been growing in like all American gardens, whether it's regionally appropriate or not, I know what it's gonna look like, but I don't know what a wine cup is gonna look like and how it's gonna grow. And I don't know if I'm gonna want that, you know? So then once you see it in someone's yard, you can make that choice.
Yeah, and don't tell anybody, but sometimes I just take seeds and just toss them around. I mean, there's a guy I know who does that. Not me. I'm sorry, not me.
No, we won't say that here. Well, thank you so much again, Camille, Clay. Again, like I said, I'm so excited that I actually have the physical copy to read over and over. This was such a joy talking to you both today. And thank you for inspiring me.
Thank you so much. This was a really delightful conversation. Thank you to Clay and to WWF and to like all of you who participated today. And
yes, absolutely. Thank you so much to our supporters again who joined us for today. Like we said, this recording will be made available on WWF's website and YouTube. And yes, happy reading, everybody.
Thanks, Camille.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.